record. I'm the wielder of the record button. All right. Well, thanks for all that introduction and level setting, Ethan. Again, my name is Sean. I'll be kind of delivering a very brief presentation on the kind of this next cycle of grant funding. It's really just to kind of answer the main questions: where does the funding come from? What is the legislative direction on how DLCD is supposed to use that funding? And then, what is this application process? What are some of the changes from the last biennium? And how do we apply, and what do the timelines look like? So we'll get into that. And then really we just have kind of an open Q&A session. And we have the entire housing team here, as well as many of our regional reps, where we can just kind of, talk through questions and see what questions you guys have. So I'll share my screen to get into this presentation. Let's see. All right. And you folks are all able to see that? Looks good? Okay, I'll just assume. All right, so let's start with some level setting on the kind of legislative context and funding. Where is this kind of money coming from? How much are these different pots of funding, and how are we supposed to use it? And I'll start by saying, as we're kind of going through this, the legislative session is still ongoing. So many of the bills that we're going to be talking about, some of them have actually been passed and adopted. Others are still kind of in the legislative process right now, so they're kind of pending. And we don't know necessarily the final amounts or what exactly is going to happen with those. We just know that they're happening, and we're starting this process now, recognizing, right, we only have 2 years to do the work, and we want to leave as much time as possible for local governments and any consultant teams to actually carry out that work. But that does mean there's a little bit of ambiguity. So I'll start with there's a lot of bills that are kind of focused on housing, with the legislature's kind of ongoing focus on housing production in the state of Oregon. There's a few bills that are going to be very relevant for this grant assistance cycle that are listed on the screen here. And I'll talk about them briefly. I won't go into depth on the specific policies behind these different bills, just recognizing the limitation on time. But we can, I'm happy to answer any questions about them as we get into discussion. And then I'll start with the one that we know has been adopted and passed. This is House Bill 2001. This was part of the kind of 60-day legislative package that the legislature delivered earlier this year. That has been adopted and signed by the governor. It includes a pretty substantial change to the way that the state will be implementing the Goal 10 housing planning goal, and that is the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis Policy. There's going to be a lot of changes on the horizon, but part of it includes funding assistance for both the ongoing implementation of Goal 10, so completing housing capacity analyses and housing production strategies. We'll talk about that later, as well as additional funding for Goal 14 implementation. So things related to urbanization, that includes urban growth boundary amendments where a need has been identified in a housing capacity analysis. That includes urban reserve planning, UGB land exchanges, as well as just general kind of concept area and development readiness planning. But we'll talk about that in the next slide. But in addition to that, there are some other bills that are kind of ongoing and in the legislative process right now. And they have kind of question marks around like whether they're going to be adopted or how much money is going to be associated with these different things. So just keep that in mind. But the first one is House Bill 3414. This is the Housing Accountability and Production Office Policy. Essentially, in short, what this is a direction to DLCD, our agency, and the Building Codes Division at the Department of Consumer and Business Services to establish a joint office called the HAPO, or the Housing Accountability and Production Office. And their job, among a few things, one of their jobs is to provide technical assistance to local governments in complying with different housing laws. So if we can think of examples like clear and objective standards, or manufactured housing, or middle housing, or a variety of state laws that exist in relationship to housing, the intent of this office is to provide assistance to local governments to, say, amend their development codes to ensure that they substantially comply with state law. So that's one bill that's kind of under consideration right now. Another bill, House Bill 3174. This is kind of a local government kind of capacity and resource bill. It includes a lot of provisions. We would actually expect a lot of the funding for the technical assistance for the HAPO to actually be included as part of this bill. That's why I kind of included here. It also might include other types of resources that are driven through the grant process here at DLCD. And then in addition to that, there's one more bill that is under consideration right now. That is Senate Bill 847. And this includes a lot of different provisions, but one of them is an expansion of the duplex requirement in the middle housing statutes to cities between 2,500 and 10,000. So right now, the middle housing provision for duplexes, specifically to allow a duplex on each lot or parcel that allows a single family detached dwelling, that applies to cities above 10,000 in population. This would extend that requirement down to cities of 2,500 or greater. So there's funding associated with the implementation of that provision specifically. So how much are we talking about when it comes to each of these different buckets? Well, it kind of depends on the bills, and we don't exactly have all the answers yet. But we do know for certain that the House Bill 2001 policy, the one that I mentioned that was adopted, includes $3.5 million in total. 2.5 million is for the kind of ongoing implementation of Goal 10, just planning for housing generally. And then we also have an additional $1 million to do urbanization related planning, things related to the urban growth boundary and planning for development readiness, public facilities, all that type of thing. When it comes to the Housing Accountability and Production Office, we know that a major core part of their responsibility is providing technical assistance to jurisdictions. But what we don't know yet is how much is going to be allocated for that office to actually use for technical assistance. So that's still kind of an outstanding question mark if that bill is adopted. And then for the duplex code amendments, that bill includes a provision of $1.25 million to aid local governments who need to amend their development codes to allow duplexes on each lot or parcel that allows for a single family detached dwelling. All right, so that's what we know about the anticipated amount of funding. Again, we expect to know more as the legislative session starts to draw towards a close. In the meantime, we're just going to get ready with application material so we know which projects need to get moving. And I'll talk through the services available. What are the different types of things that we're going to be able to support with all of these different types of funding? Many of these are things that are probably familiar to a lot of folks in this room. These are services that we've offered before, but you might notice that our menu of options has increased pretty substantially. So on the top here, these first four categories of projects are things that we've offered in the past. This includes development code assistance. So like if you need to amend your development codes to allow middle housing, or you need to do a clear and objective audit, that type of thing, this is what that is for. There's the housing capacity analysis. This is an analysis to determine whether a city has sufficient buildable lands within their urban growth boundary to accommodate 20 years of growth. I have an asterisk there that I'll talk about in a minute. There's the housing production strategy. This is kind of seen as a follow-up to the housing capacity analysis, in which a city identifies essentially what their game plan is for the next 6 or 8 years to support the development of housing within their urban growth boundary. And then there's a housing implementation plan, which is essentially a catch-all for anything that's not a housing capacity analysis or housing production strategy. There's a lot of different types of projects that don't really fall neatly into one of those two categories. You could think of like a funding plan or an affordable housing plan, or a variety of different project types that don't neatly fit in those categories. So we have kind of a catch-all term for that. In addition to those projects that we've kind of offered in the past, we're also expanding our scope of services to include a lot of things related to urbanization and development readiness. And that includes things related to the UGB. This includes an urban growth boundary land exchange. This is an option for local governments where maybe they haven't identified a deficiency, but they see that there might be lands that are more development ready that they could exchange lands inside the UGB for. This would help provide funding for that type of project. There is an urban growth boundary amendment. When a city identifies a deficiency of lands, they're required by law to address that deficiency, including through a UGB amendment. And this is that process to essentially undergo the Goal 14 analysis to determine the area that a city expands into. There is urban reserve planning, which is a process by which a city kind of figures out which lands over the next 50 years are going to be ready for urbanization at some point in the future. So it kind of provides greater certainty as to where a city will be growing or expanding into over time. And then there's kind of concept area and development readiness planning. The basic idea here is we know when it comes to the development of housing, it takes more than just having land in the UGB. You have to make sure that land is development ready, shovel ready, that it's annexed, that it allows housing through a straightforward process, and that it's readily serviced with public facilities and infrastructure. That's the purpose of this plan, to really think through that and get that land ready for development once it's either once it's brought into the UGB or if it's already existing inside the UGB. So one quick note here. If you are a city above 10,000, one thing to keep in mind is that the law has changed with regard to housing capacity analyses and housing production strategies. But in short, we are directed to undergo a very substantial rulemaking in the next biennium, as well as developing kind of a statewide methodology to estimate housing need. And those are not going to be ready until the statutory deadlines of January 1st of 2025. So this means that if a city were to try to start a housing capacity analysis in this biennium, they would not actually have the information they need to complete that analysis. So we do not recommend, if you haven't started a housing capacity analysis yet, we would not recommend applying for a housing capacity analysis or starting one right now. If you are a city that has already started the process, the bill includes a provision by which LCDC can kind of extend the application of the old statute to you so you don't have to redo work. But if you are a city that has not started yet and you have an upcoming deadline, we have statutory authority to simply extend your deadline to say a later date that works for you and your city. So if you are in that boat of a city with an upcoming deadline, but you haven't started yet, we will be reaching out to you. And of course, please feel free to reach out to us to figure out when that deadline should be. But we do not recommend applying for one in this round of funding. And then the only other thing I would like to note here is on kind of non-housing DLCD technical assistance. So DLCD regularly receives technical assistance for other planning work that's not necessarily related to housing, including things like economic development or Goal 7, Goal 5, things that will be available, but in a separate process. So keep your eyes peeled for that. I'm sure your regional reps will have a lot more detail once that's available. And then another note that I wanted to provide is on the HAPO itself. So once the Housing Accountability and Production Office, assuming the bill is passed, is up and running, a lot of the projects that they're going to be doing are going to be based on investigations that they do into potential violations of housing law. So if you are a city and you know your code needs some work, we highly encourage applying for development code assistance in the in this application process, but don't feel like this is your only chance. If the HAPO identifies potential violations of state law, they will follow up with any available funding to help address any potential inconsistencies with a code. So just keep that in mind as we get into this application process. All right, so let's talk about the application process itself and like who can apply and how do you apply, what are we going to be looking for? And we'll start with who can apply. It's essentially any local government or regional entity that would be able to make use or pursue a housing planning project. So this includes obviously cities and counties that are pursuing housing planning projects, but it also includes, say, regional entities, and that could include councils of government, that could include counties that are doing a regional project, or just regional government entities themselves who might want to do a joint project involving a lot of different jurisdictions. They're also welcome to apply. And then we also have added a provision to enable third parties to submit applications on behalf of a city, though we want to recognize, right, funding is going to be contingent on the ability of a jurisdiction to actually manage a project, right? So that's just one thing to keep in mind. Who's going to be kind of point on that project is a very important thing to identify. To apply, we are going to be distributing on June 1st, and I'll get into timelines on a future slide. We're going to be distributing an application form and associated materials. And we've made some changes since the last round to make it easier for local governments to apply. So on this application, like any application, you're going to provide us kind of general information about the project. What is the city? Who's the contact points? What's the project type? How much do we expect in terms of kind of timeline and resources needed? But one of the major changes that we're making, right, if we harken back to these slides over here where I show this project list, one of the things that we did last round that was very useful for local governments that we wanted to build on that makes the process easier is for each one of these project types, for the most part, the scope of work or the work program where you outline all of the different steps that you need to complete the project. Oftentimes for these different types of projects, they're pretty standard, right? A housing capacity analysis consists of the same types of things, regardless of which city it's in, with maybe some modifications here and there to kind of support, a particular situation or thing that a city wants to do, right? And so last biennium, we provided some sample scope of work language that local governments kind of crafted into their own individual scopes of work that they submitted with the application. What we've decided to do this round is if you're applying for a standard project type, we will provide you a sample scope of work. And if it looks roughly similar to what you want to do, you don't have to submit a scope of work to us. That is good enough. We've essentially kind of written out all of these different scopes of work for you, and you don't have to submit all these additional details and project details in a separate attachment. But if you are a city that has a very specific kind of custom tailored and bespoke project that involves all of the bells and whistles that you want to have in there, you are welcome to do that, but we will need a scope of work. We need to know what the project is and what the major components are, right? So just keeping that in mind, if you're just planning on applying for a standard project type, just apply for that and just indicate, yes, the sample scope of work looks about right, and we can make changes down the line. All right. And then I'll also talk through our kind of project selection criteria. Obviously, $3.5 million plus whatever comes through these other bills is going to be a substantial chunk of change. It's not limitless, right? So we have to have criteria by which we, prioritize the spending of grant funding. And we've simplified this into three major categories. The first one, and this one always has to be first, is to help cities that are required to come into statutory compliance with the law, right? So if you are a city that's required to adopt, a housing capacity analysis or housing production strategy, recognizing that, the landscape's shifting, right? So we talk to us about deadlines. That is kind of the first thing. So if you need to update your codes to come in compliance with the law, if you need to do a housing capacity analysis and production strategy, if you need to amend a UGB because you've identified a deficiency of lands in your previous housing capacity analysis, those are the types of projects that we have to kind of put at the top of the priority, recognizing what this funding is allocated for. But then after that, our two major kind of guiding principles is how much does the project kind of facilitate housing production, affordability, and choice. And so that really gets us to our second and third categories. The second one is, hey, is this project going to facilitate housing production, affordability, and choice, especially for a smaller and more capacity constrained jurisdiction? That's going to be an important criteria. And then the third one is, hey, does this project help achieve fair and equitable housing outcomes? That's another priority area where we want to be directing grant assistance, right? So those are the three kind of major things to be emphasizing as you think through what type of assistance you might want to apply for. All right, now let's talk through timeline. So today, May 17th, this is kind of our housing assistance informational webinar. This is kind of a bit of a notice, right, to let you know that grant application materials are going to be coming out soon. Those are going to be distributed on June 1st, and we're going to distribute them both through our regional reps. We're going to send them over to our partners over at places like LOC and AOC, and we're going to distribute them on our Housing Gov delivery. So if you'd like to be notified directly, please feel free to sign up for that Housing Gov delivery. You can find that on our webpage. And we will obviously be publishing it far and wide to try to get as many folks the ability to apply as possible. After those application materials are published, we're going to have our kind of standard or regular open forum on June 5th, where we kind of, open it up for questions again, see what questions folks have about the application process or what they need to include with their applications. And we'll have an opportunity for folks to participate there. Our application deadline is going to be July 31st. So this provides 2 months for jurisdictions essentially to fill out a form and, talk to their councils about it and make sure that they know what projects they want to apply for. And so that is the deadline. And then we will have a month where we kind of review those applications and make funding decisions, right, based on those priority criteria I described previously. And we'll issue kind of an award notice on September 1st. And that's when we'll start working with local jurisdictions to establish grant agreements and consultant contracts. And it will include both direct grants where we provide cities, counties, and regional governments, just funding outright for different projects, as well as DLCD provided consultants similar to this last biennium. And then, the timing, it's going to depend on, how long it takes for us to get grant agreements and contracts inked, but we generally expect this to happen, between kind of October and December. Generally, grant agreements take less time to execute than consultant contracts, which require a lot of different cities in one contract. So that's just something to keep in mind as you guys are applying. And then we'll hopefully get the work started early next year. And then we will have until kind of May to June of 2025 to actually complete it. That's the end of the biennium when we have to kind of spend this money and get it out the door. And so with that, I think we can kind of back up and move into question and answer. I see the chat has gotten populated with a variety of things, and I'm happy to kind of start diving into those. Yeah, Ethan, do you have any thoughts?
Thanks, Sean. No, I think I responded to all of the questions in the chat, but for the sake of the recording, maybe we kind of just speak those into the recording here. So the first question was, will we have access to the recording? Yes, we'll post the recording after today's meeting. And the next one was a question about, what if the city's housing capacity analysis deadline comes within the current biennium? And Sean, I think you addressed that. But maybe if you want
just to reiterate,
yeah,
it depends whether you've started or not. So if you've started, the bill gives LCDC the authority to essentially say, all right, you're clearly already doing this work and we don't want to ask you to redo this work. So we're going to kind of extend the old rules for you just to finish out this project. If you haven't started yet and you have an upcoming deadline, we have the authority to simply move your deadline later, right? So if you're in that boat, come talk to us. We're going to be working with cities based on their situation to kind of figure out what's going to be the best time for them to complete their housing capacity analysis and production strategy.
Yeah, and then another question that's on the similar topic. Does that recommendation to wait on a housing capacity analysis also include counties? And I guess I'll add cities below 10,000 to that question.
Yeah, well, I guess first, housing capacity analyses in the context of counties. Counties don't have, well, actually, I guess this would be Wallowa County, so would you mean a housing capacity analysis specific to maybe like the city of Enterprise in Wallowa County? Is that what you're referring to? Because UGBs are specific to cities.
Right. This is Franz Goebel. Our commissioners have directed us to do a county-wide housing capacity analysis that includes multiple small towns and rural areas. Recently, Enterprise did one, but that we would like to incorporate the information. But really, a good portion of the county resides outside of city limits, and that affects our capacities.
Yeah, so the challenge here is that House Bill 2001 amended the standard way that a city does a housing capacity analysis. Specifically requires that when you're doing a housing capacity analysis, that you use numbers that are produced by the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis. It gives that responsibility to the Department of Administrative Services, specifically the Office of Economic Analysis, to run those numbers periodically. And their first deadline, the first kind of batch of numbers, are going to be run on January 1st of 2025, which means that for most of this biennium, if a city were to try to start a housing capacity analysis, it wouldn't have the numbers. So that's the major challenge that kind of exists therein, is that changing landscape. Now, obviously, the bill drafters recognizing that, hey, some cities are already in the process of doing this. They've already started the work, essentially, and we don't want to change it on them. The bill allows LCDC for those cities in that situation to essentially extend the old rules to them. But if you're a city that hasn't really started yet, it wouldn't be a great idea to start now, because if you did it based on the old way, it wouldn't be a defensible housing capacity analysis legally, if that makes sense. So like, let's say you identified a deficiency of lands inside a UGB, you actually couldn't use that capacity analysis to justify a UGB amendment. That's the major challenge.
So it sounds like from a countywide standpoint that we might want to wait. Is that just, if we're trying to use that to help inform our strategic decisions, then it's probably best to wait.
It would probably be best to wait. There is work you can do in the interim. I mean, hypothetically, you can do like a buildable lands inventory countywide, that type of thing. But for example, like you're just not going to know what the needed housing is over the next 20 years because those numbers won't be available until 2025.
Yeah, the shifting landscape does throw a wrench into things, but I think we're willing to work with jurisdictions as they're going through that process, provide advice, and help you do that strategic thinking. So just let us know. Get in touch. We're happy to help. So continuing on some of these questions, Sandy asked, what is needed to show council support? So part of our required procurement requirements is that there is some sort of agreement at the local level to engage in this work. So in the past, we've typically done that through like a council resolution, so that we can, have some sort of vote that's taken place at the local level to show support and to kind of agree to engage in that process. Sean.
And we're considering one change. We're making sure this works with our grant folks. But one of the things that we heard is, hey, for an individual city, it might make sense to submit a resolution, right, showing that we talked to our councils and they support the project. But if we have maybe like a regional project where we have like a half a dozen cities, right, it's going to be a lot harder to get a resolution for each one. So would it be possible to get kind of a letter of support, right, in lieu of a resolution? And we're kind of asking our folks internally right now if that's acceptable. But it's one of the options that we're considering specifically for joint projects, recognizing it's hard to corral the cats, right?
Right. And especially another kind of just tidbit on that doesn't necessarily have to be included in the application. That show of council support needs to be concluded before the contract is finalized. So that gives some additional time, that gives the council a chance to see if they've even been awarded the grant in the first place. So there is some time there to do that. I know that there's some issues getting on council agendas, so that gives some additional time as well. Let's see. City of Rainier solar update, or overdue for a comp plan update. Is there going to be funding for such a project? So we are in a space where we can, under House Bill 2001, that $3.5 million is only available for housing related work. So there are, of course, an update to a comprehensive plan includes housing, but it also includes other things, economic development, parks, so on and so forth. So we could potentially fund a portion of that. The other venue for kind of that full-on comprehensive plan update is through the general technical assistance program that the department runs, which will be coming on later. And part of our job as the department is to try to coordinate those two application processes and those grant programs. So I think we did a fairly good job of that in the last biennium, and we'll continue to kind of make sure that we're matching and using the right funds for the right kinds of projects.
Yeah, I see a question from Steve Coper. Too.
Please, yeah.
I know you've been talking a lot. So this is one of two. Our last H&A in 2019 set a goal to update the BLI every 2 years, which is ambitious. Kudos to that. But our next H&A is not due until 2026 under the adopted schedule. Is the BLI an eligible project under Goal 10 Housing Technical Assistance? Is there any reason why we should simply wait on the BLI until we start the next H&A? That's a great question. And the answer is yes, you could apply for a BLI because there haven't really been such substantial changes to the BLI. Essentially, what we've been tasked to do there is to provide jurisdictions off-the-shelf methodological assumptions to make the BLI a little bit more straightforward for them. That won't be available because we'll be working on that this next biennium, but you could apply for a BLI. Just keep in mind, because it's not statutorily required, right? We have to prioritize those statutory requirements first. But yeah, you're welcome to apply for that. And awesome. Yeah, should we move on? Do we want to tag? Do any of our other housing team members want to tag team questions? I don't know.
Jump on in.
I know we've been talking a lot.
I got the next one from the city of Yachats. So the city is working on a housing implementation plan, but you have not done a housing production strategy. Are they the same? They are technically different projects. A housing production strategy is a requirement for a city above population 10,000. That doesn't mean that cities below 10,000 population couldn't voluntarily do a housing production strategy. They certainly could, but the city of Yachats in particular is not required to do so. And that housing implementation plan for a city like Yachats is probably functioning very similarly to a housing production strategy. Nick's question about developing a homelessness plan. I think that would fall under the category of a housing implementation plan. So that's kind of like this general catch-all phrase for things that aren't housing production strategies or housing capacity analyses. And that's kind of a perfect example of kind of that housing implementation plan type of project. Let's see. Rachel from Amity asks, are the three mentioned criteria funding priorities, or do you have to meet all three? Those are funding priorities. So as we're looking at the total number of applications and the types of applications that we'll be getting, we'll prioritize those funding using those funding priorities. So first and foremost, most likely all of those statutory required projects will receive that first bite at the apple, then we'll move into the next priorities. So that's kind of how we'll be structuring our award decisions.
And I can jump in now to give your voice a break.
Okay.
All right, Steve, this is your second question. Is the technical assistance currently available for either consultant assistance or direct grant to do a clear and objective housing regulation code audit and development code update? Would this project also fit under pending technical assistance for House Bill 3417, the HAPO bill? And the answer to that is yes. I should have mentioned this. I apologize for not mentioning this explicitly in the presentation, but similar to last biennium, one of the options we provided is, hey, if you're a local government, you can either apply for a direct grant where we, essentially just give you cash if you want to do the work in-house, or hire a consultant team on your own to do it. That's an option available to you. But for some cities where, they might not want to open an RFP or manage a contract by themselves, we also offer DLCD provided consultants. We're actually going to be opening an RFP to kind of get a big old bench of consultants together. So that way we can continue providing that option for local governments. And yes, absolutely, a clear and objective housing regulation code audit and making sure that your development code is up to date and consistent with statutes. That is absolutely a project type that you can apply for, and very much falls into that category of like things you need to do for statutory compliance, and very much falls under what the HAPO is intended, the Housing Accountability and Production Office is intended to do. So highly encourage that if you know that your development code has some issues, we definitely encourage applying. And Steve, I see you wanted to follow up.
Yeah, thank you for your response. I'm just wondering, does it also fall under that Goal 10 one? Because that one's already been approved, but you're saying the other one's pending. So could you apply under either?
You could apply under either. I'd say the HAPO bill passing would be definitely very good to make sure that we can fund all of these projects, right? Because it's going to come with a very substantial amount of assistance and direction from the legislature to use it for that purpose. Whereas the House Bill 2001 funding, it's really about Goal 10 implementation and Goal 14 implementation. So, right, that kind of changes the priorities a little bit, right? So definitely it would be good that the HAPO bill includes that funding and passes, so that way we can use that funding for that purpose and have that priority explicitly. But either way, I would suggest applying for it.
Do you know the timeline for that one exactly?
When it's adopted?
Yeah, when it might be. I mean,
we're getting into legislative sausage making. We don't know. We just know that the legislative session ends June 30th.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you.
Yeah, so that is a moving target, certainly. But I will say that either if the HAPO 3414 were to pass, we could, it's just a matter of priorities. The clear and objective audit could certainly be something that you apply for under the House Bill 2001. That's kind of our DLCD's decision to make about which pot of funding that comes out of. But generally, I would say, like Sean is mentioning, highly encourage an application for a project like that. It definitely fits the bill. Okay, where did we leave off? Thank you, regional reps, for jumping in there and answering some of your community's questions there. So Gail's got a question about, does capacity building include hiring staff? Okay, so Sean mentioned the two different types of ways that a project can be funded, right? There's the direct grant process where the city is receiving funds directly from DLCD to hire their own consultant, do their own procurement process, or to hire staff to do that particular project. There's also the DLCD provided consultant route, which would say, local government would say, I don't want to do a procurement process. It's going to take way too long. I'll just use one of DLCD's consultants, and DLCD then handles all the invoicing with the consultants. We pay all the invoices. We do the contracting. All of that kind of stuff is handled by DLCD, and all the city has to do is wait for that invite to the kickoff meeting. So there's two pathways there. Gail, if you're interested in hiring staff to do a particular project, I would encourage you to use the direct grant route. Just note that that funding expires at the end of the biennium, and that's not a permanent funding route for staff.
I'll also add to, just so you are aware of this bill and can track it. I don't know all the specifics of the bill, but it's House Bill 3174. This is that kind of local capacity bill that's currently under consideration by the legislature. I do believe it does include funding specifically for kind of local capacity to hire staff, that type of thing, but I don't know the details. So definitely a legislative conversation to keep track of. I can take on the next one. Oh, wait, Kelly, I see you responded to another question. Thank you for that. Sandy, I see you have, for use of funding under Goal 14, if you want to create a concept plan or development readiness plan, does it have to focus on housing, or could it be to meet employment needs under Goal 9? So Sandy, this is one of those instances where the money that was allocated under House Bill 2001 has to have a connection and nexus with housing. When we talk about concept planning and development readiness, it can include, like, for example, areas can include mixed use areas with like community assets and employment opportunities in that area to support residents. That can be that type of mixed use development is something that we encourage and support, but there has to be a connection with housing. We can't, say, for example, do a concept plan for just an expansion area identified in, say, like an economic opportunities analysis, because the direction from the legislature was to use that funding for housing specifically. All right, so we have another one from McRae Carmichael. Would building land inventory qualify potentially? Can you elaborate on that question, McRae, if you're on the call?
Hi. Hi everyone. McRae Carmichael with the Mid-Willamette Valley Council of Governments. What I'm curious about was I heard you reference buildable land inventories. And I'm just sitting here. It's good to hear where you are and what the focus is. And I'm thinking about our members and if they're ready for housing capacity analysis, is that the term, and the housing needs analysis, or if some of our communities are maybe better situated just to do a building lands inventory first. And if we could, just be building blocks to where we need to be. So I was curious if that is appropriate. You didn't necessarily call it out.
Yes, you could. So yeah, a housing capacity analysis consists of two components, right? The needed housing side of it, where you calculate what your need's going to look like, and then the buildable lands inventory. It's really the needed housing that's changing, and that we don't have, like, the numbers aren't going to be available until January 1st of 2025. So that's like why we don't recommend doing a housing capacity analysis. But if a city wants to get ready and do a BLI and get ready, that is 100% something that they could apply for under this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems like something we potentially, and I'll say this out loud for other people who might be like a cog, that we could potentially bundle a service for several members to be able to do at least getting the BLI and have a roadmap potentially with you all and other organizations of how we get maybe a regional and or a regional housing capacity analysis in a few years. So just trying to think strategically about how we can help our members and get the data for this.
Definitely.
Thank you.
Totally. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and if I could just continue on that point, I think one of the things that we've experienced over the last couple of biennia running these grant programs is that those really, really small jurisdictions just either, one, aren't aware of the opportunity to receive funding, or two, just don't have the capacity even to fill out an application. And so one of the ways, or kind of trying to tackle that in two different ways this year, by simply allowing a local government just to check a box and say, we're going to use your scope of work DLCD. All I'm going to do is just indicate that I'm interested in a housing capacity analysis, for example. That's great. Then we can continue to have that conversation with that local government staff and just say, all right, what do you really need here? And it's kind of a follow-up question. It's not you don't have to provide a scope of work as a prerequisite just to apply. And then second is to kind of think through regionalizing those those programs or those projects. So the Wallowa County example that was raised, or McRae having, doing providing the opportunity for smaller local governments in the Mid-Valley to use the COG as kind of the conduit for that funding and the grant administration and all of that kind of stuff is another great opportunity. We've kind of offered all of those plus more to try to get to those particularly small local governments. Okay, let's see here. So Crystal had a question about, is there a program that would best fit a city of under 2,500 to assist with a housing analysis or buildable lands analysis? Yeah, so that's just kind of all of the programs that, or all of the funding that DLCD will have available to us. We'll try to figure out which pot of funding is right to match your project. But you don't, as the local government planner, don't have to try to sit there and try to figure out which pot of funding it needs to come from. That's something that DLCD will do. All we ask of you is just indicate your interest in the project and we'll figure out where the funds come from. Let's see. Tommy has a question about SB 406. Thanks for the question, Tommy. No official comments. All that we know is that there is a need for technical assistance for those areas in Tillamook County. It should SB 406 pass, and we're kind of ready and prepared for that reality. Let's see. Okay, Shannon asked kind of follow up on the code updates. So again, yeah, if your local government or your jurisdiction is interested in going through something like a code update or a development code audit or something like that, all that you need to do is just indicate that in the application. And like I mentioned in the response before, we'll figure out which pot of funding that needs to come from and how to prioritize that.
Exactly.
Rebecca. Oh,
also, sorry for going off camera. Sorry, Palmer was calling me, so I just seen. I don't know.
No problem. No problem.
Yeah,
Rebecca asked. Oh yeah, so we're both jumping on it. Rebecca asked, "Will there be a local match requirement?" No, so no local match requirement to participate in that. Dan asked about Section 2 of 3414. So let's see. I'm going to finish reading your question here. Okay. Yeah, that seems like a question. I'm happy to chat with you, Dan, outside of this meeting. But since it isn't necessarily related to technical assistance, I think I'll pass on that one, unfortunately.
I can speak to Tara's question on development readiness. Yeah, to clarify, development readiness planning for areas within the UGB may qualify for funding under Goal 14 assistance. Yeah. So essentially the premise of that particular item is, hey, you might have an area inside the UGB. Maybe you amended your UGB and you brought in some lands that aren't annexed yet, or you have some lands that have been sitting around, and they could use some planning to essentially make them more development ready with the infrastructure planning and annexation requirements, everything related to that. The basic premise of that like deliverable is to provide kind of a concept area plan that gets that land ready for development, including planning, like what infrastructure do we need? What are the appropriate zoning provisions that we need? These generally often accompany UGB expansion areas when cities do them. Either, there's a few examples in both the Metro as well as in Bend, but it's really intended that once land is brought into the UGB, that it's ready for development and ready to go. But it can definitely be applied to lands that are already inside the UGB that, maybe have just been vacant for a long time and not really, developing the way the city has intended. So yeah, so absolutely, that is something you can apply for, provided it has that nexus with housing development.
Wonderful. I think we've gone through the list of written questions at this point. Anybody have any kind of follow-up questions to what has already been either asked or responded to, or anything else that they would like to pose for the group? Okay. Hearing none, I don't want to hold on the line if we don't have anything to talk about, but do we have any kind of next steps that we want to share with the group? Anybody on the housing team? Or Kelly has a question. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to share an observation that as you all were asking questions about development code updates, that I think, and the housing team can correct me if I'm wrong, but that if a jurisdiction did a development code update to address issues with the housing code, removing barriers to housing development, that would that is a housing production strategy that you'd kind of get credit for when you do complete your housing production strategy. And so you can also think of that benefit, in thinking about whether you want to apply for a grant or take on a project, that you'll kind of be able to claim credit for that strategy when it comes time to do your HPS. And that at least in my region, I have some jurisdictions that are completing their housing production strategies like right now or very in the next couple of months. And there may be individual strategies within those documents that would be good content for, a housing implementation plan grant for the next biennium. That's all.
Yeah, it's a good point. Thanks for that, Kelly. I think especially for those cities above 10,000 population, it's a good opportunity to either do some of that pre-work that is kind of leading into your housing production strategy if you have one of those deadlines looming, or to kind of consider your strategic plan of sorts in terms of when you might be engaging in a housing capacity analysis in light of things like the Oregon housing needs analysis and the rules kind of changing. So I think it's, this a little bit of this transitionary time, but I think it also opens up the opportunity for some creative thinking about both the funding that's available at the state, but also your budget, your timeline, your council priorities. So Jacqueline.
Hi there, thank you. This might be out of the scope of this meeting, but in Yachats, we just finished the housing needs analysis and we're finishing the implementation plan. A lot of the lands that have been identified as available for housing, it's theoretical. I think there's a lot that will not be able to be developed with housing. We've got CCNRs in place, we've got hills and things of that sort. Is there a possibility of, I know that Walport, for instance, has a big chunk of land that they're now bringing utilities and stuff to. Has there ever been where a city like Yachats and Walport will work together where housing is developed perhaps in Walport, and Yachats helps develop a public transportation connection between the cities that would help with the housing that we need as well as them, and the transportation in between. So we're not expanding our UGB if we need to, we're actually sharing lands with another city. Is that something that ever gets done or is a possibility?
We've seen examples of it. Normally, these are connected. I think the best example that I can think of is in the context of the Salem-Keizer UGB. Of course, one of the complexities, and I would encourage if a regional rep knows about this situation to chime in, because I'm definitely not an expert here. They do share a UGB, right? And so that I don't know if that changes the dynamics. I actually don't know if two cities that I don't know if they have to be contingent with one another or not, or contiguous. I don't know if it's possible to share housing need across lines through an intergovernmental agreement. This is actually kind of an interesting legal question. I don't know, Patrick, anybody on the line have any thoughts here? Yeah.
I've got thoughts. I just sent a message to my colleague, Melissa, because we have been chatting about Millersburg's economic development activity, their challenges with their urbanization, and the city of Jefferson that's just over the county line, a state highway 5 miles away. Jacqueline, that's a great idea. And I think as regional reps, I think it resonates probably with all of us, particularly for our smaller cities that are capacity resource constrained. So if it's not a good fit under this particular housing focus grant program, keep your eyes peeled, talk to Brett Estes about, or is it Huey? Who's your rep?
It's
Wait,
what?
yeah.
It's
Huey.
Huey. Okay, talk to Huey. Talk to Huey about the upcoming general fund technical assistance grant biennium 2023-25 that'll be soliciting we'll be soliciting applications for those in about 2 months.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yeah, but I do think it raises an interesting legal question that we'll talk internally about it and see like what is the statute. I actually don't know. So that's a good question.
Yeah. It was hard. It was hard to hear that, Melissa. I'm not sure if anybody else is sure.
Sorry, can you hear me now? I'm happy to help with anyone research.
I think Melissa said that she's happy to help given the experience with Salem Kaiser's UGB. Yes, potentially. Okay, head nod. Awesome. Sorry, it was a little hard to hear you there, Melissa. Fred's got a good question in the chat about the sequencing of things. So do you need to complete a housing production strategy before you can apply for an implementation strategy, or is it possible to apply for both together? Really good question about what is the difference between these two types of planning documents. So a housing production strategy is a statutorily required document and planning exercise to fulfill goal 10 for cities above population 10,000. That housing production strategy includes or is required to include the list of strategies, tools, actions, and policies that the city might be deploying and implementing to facilitate the production of their identified housing need. And that identified housing need comes from the housing capacity analysis that they would do 1 year prior. I would describe a housing implementation plan as a more detailed look at one or more of those strategies that have been identified in a housing production strategy. So let's kind of harken back to Nick Sneed's question about a homelessness plan. So say one of the strategies that city has provided in their housing production strategy is to study the set of strategies related to mitigating the impacts or people experiencing homelessness or something like that. A housing implementation plan to implement that housing production strategy might be to create a homelessness plan, very similar to what Nick is talking about in Madras. So I hope that kind of describes the difference where a housing implementation plan is like actually doing the thing that you've set forth in your housing production strategy, whereas a housing production strategy is identifications of the policy and the timelines that you'll be implementing those under. If the city is under 10,000. Okay, so then if a city is under 10,000, kind of continuing that frame of, or that kind of thought process there, if a city is under population 10,000, they're not required to go through that housing production strategy process. They could, like I've mentioned, they could voluntarily do that. Say a city under 10,000 is interested in doing something related to housing. Maybe they've got a housing capacity analysis that they've recently adopted, and they're thinking about what's next. Maybe they want to focus on affordable, capital A, affordable housing. They could do a housing implementation. They could apply for a housing implementation plan project to think through a particular set of strategies to focus particularly on enticing development of affordable housing within their community. That could be an example, but it's not a required exercise for cities under population 10,000.
Should we talk through the question on the budget estimate for grant funding?
Okay, so
yeah, one thing to keep in mind that's important here. If you are applying for a DLCD provided consultant, don't worry about cost. We will handle that and figure that out with the consultant teams and you know, based on the projects and the things that they're asking for. But if you're applying for a direct grant and you're like, all right, well, we expect to hire a consultant for this, but we don't really know how to estimate costs. How do we figure this out? My best advice would be to talk to some consultant teams about what you want to do, what the kind of parameters of the project are, and get a sense of relative cost for the application. The reason I say that is because there are like rough costs for different types of project types that are included in them, but that are included in the grant applications, but they really vary based on what the local government actually wants to do. For example, like if you want to do a lot of public outreach and engagement, right, that has a different cost than a project that's more like a kind of narrow and focused one. if you want a lot of different reports and analyses, right, that has a cost implication. It all really depends on the details of the project. So if you are doing a direct grant and you want to, hire a consultant, I would definitely just recommend talking to them about the different project parameters that you expect to be part of that and get some cost estimates. That would probably be the best way.
And the other housing team folks might be trying to kick me under the table, but I'll also offer us as a resource for answering some of those questions. We've gone through this a couple times now and have a real rough general sense of what those particular tasks might cost, and we can kind of give you a real rough estimate. But the consultant is definitely more in tune with what it might actually take. Okay. Any last questions, comments? I'll open it up to regional reps if you have any last tidbits to add.
Okay.
That is totally fine. Sean, maybe for the purpose of just next steps, could you pull up that slide with the timeline again, and we can kind of just walk through that one last time before we
you bet.
close.
I'm going to share my screen really fast. All right. Yeah, so just reminders on those dates. I know I mentioned this previously, but so today, right, we have our informational webinar, and we'll post this on YouTube. We'll send it to our regional reps so they can send it to all of their members, anybody who might have had to miss today's presentation. And then the actual materials will be released on June 1st to apply, including all the materials that I mentioned, the application form, the sample scopes of work, everything, right? Just take a minute to carefully review those and see what type of project that you want to do, that type of thing. And we'll have an open forum on June 5th where you can kind of come ask questions, try, figure out different things on how you want to structure your project. And then the deadline to submit will be July 31st. So there's a 2-month window, right, to complete that application. And then we'll have a month to kind of review those applications and make funding decisions. And we'll release those funding decisions on September 1st. Then we'll move into contracting, which we expect to take a few months. It depends kind of on how fast the turnaround times are for different grant agreements. Anything else, Ethan? All righty. Well, we'll also include these slides when we upload this presentation, so that way you guys have everything in front of you, and we will, we'll be available if you have questions. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
you.